This is the second reading for the American Revolution playlist in United States history regarding the 250 years, 2.5 centuries of the United States experiment. This is titled The Path Toward Independence by Professor of American History Pauline Maier at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Independence was not what the colonists wanted, not in 1763 when they celebrated Britain's triumph in the French and Indian War, nor was it their goal a decade later in 1776 when they accepted a, quote, separate and equal station, end quote, among the powers of the earth with more resignation than joy. But in the mid-1760s, as the two sides began a series of conflicts that led where neither wanted to go, the story began with a dispute over taxes. No taxation without representation. Britain did not ask the colonists to help retire the heavy debt it acquired in the course of the French and Indian War, but after a massive American Indian uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion, the British government decided it had to keep an army in North America to hold and police its new possessions, and that the colonists should help the bill. In March of 1764, George Grenville, the King's First Lord of the Treasury, asked Parliament to enact a series of new or revised duties on certain goods imported into the American colonies, including a 3 pence per gallon duty on molasses from the non-British West Indies. The preamble of that measure, known as the Sugar Act, said it was meant to raise revenue in America for, quote, defraying the expense of defending, protecting, and securing the same, end quote. Then, because the Sugar Act was unlikely to raise enough money, Grenville announced plans for another measure, a stamp tax that would require the attachment of tax stamps to certain items sold in America. The Stamp Act that Parliament finally passed in March of 1765 imposed stamp taxes on pamphlets, almanacs, newspapers, etc., playing cards, dice, and, of course, a wide range of legal documents. Never before had Parliament imposed taxes directly on the colonists. Moreover, the new taxes had to be paid in gold or silver, which were not readily available everywhere in America. And violators would be tried in admiralty courts, which had no juries, and whose jurisdiction was usually confined to cases that concerned shipping and the seas. Some Americans raised economic objections to the Sugar Act. If strictly enforced, they said the molasses duty would choke off trade with the non-British West Indies and seriously erode the colonists' capacity to purchase British goods. Other critics argued that a duty designed to raise revenue was a tax, and since the tax was, quote, laid on us without our privity and consent, end quote, as the North Carolina legislature said in October of 1764, it violated the colonists' inherent right of imposing our own taxes. Opposition to the Stamp Act was more widespread, however, and passionate than that of the opposition to the Sugar Act. It turned exclusively on the issue of rights. In Britain, the colonists insisted taxes were free gifts of the people that could be granted to the government only by the people personally or through their representatives. Freedom from taxes without consent was the undoubted right of Englishmen, including His Majesty's subjects in America, who were, as the Colonist Stamp Act Congress declared in October of 1765, entitled to all the inherent rights and liberties of his natural-born subjects within the Kingdom of Great Britain. Since colonists did not send representatives to the British House of Commons, Parliament had no right to tax them. Only their elected provincial assemblies could do that, and Parliament could not interfere with the colonists' inherent and invaluable right to trial by jury. By laying taxes on the colonists and extending the jurisdiction of admiralty courts, the Stamp Act had a manifest tendency to subvert the rights and liberties of the colonists. British defenders of the Stamp Act usually agreed with the principle of no taxation without representation. They insisted, however, that the colonists were represented in Parliament, that the colonists or the Americans elected no delegates to the House of Commons was irrelevant. 9/10 of the British people could not vote for members of Parliament, like Englishmen who could not vote, and indeed, like all British subjects, the colonists were virtually represented by members of Parliament who spoke not only for their constituents, but also for the good of all the British people everywhere. Parliament, therefore, could tax them just as it taxed other subjects of the king. But the situation of colonists differed from that of non-voting Englishmen, replied the pamphleteer Daniel Dulany of Maryland in 1765. Members of Parliament, their constituents, and non-voting subjects all had to pay whatever taxes the House of Commons approved. They therefore were held together by a bond of interest that did not include the Americans. Instead, the more Parliament taxed the colonists, the more it relied on the tax burden of Britons at home. Virtual representation might work within Britain, but it could not cross the Atlantic. Dulany's pamphlet made him a hero throughout the colonies, but before long, Richard Bland of Virginia went one step further. Virtual representation made no sense anywhere. I cannot comprehend, he said, how men who are excluded from voting at the election of members of Parliament can be represented in that assembly, or how those who are elected do not sit in the House as representatives of their constituents. End quote. If 90% of the people within Britain were disenfranchised, that was a great defect in the British system of government, indeed an institutional failure. From Bland's perspective, a putrid part of the Constitution that some patriotic spirits should repair. Confident that they could be represented only by delegates chosen by themselves, the colonists denied Parliament's right to tax them in petitions that Parliament refused to receive. They also passed resolutions asserting their right in both their provincial assemblies and the Stamped Act Congress at New York, where delegates from 9 colonies, all but New Hampshire, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, met in the month of September and the month of October in 1765. Finally, when all else failed, they prevented the Stamp Act from going into effect. On the 14th of August, 1765, a crowd in Boston displayed, paraded, and finally destroyed an effigy of Andrew Oliver, which was the man appointed to distribute stamps in Massachusetts. Later, a mob attacked Oliver's home. The next day, he resigned his office. And since nobody was likely to replace him, the Stamp Act could not be executed in the Bay Colony. Soon, stamp distributors throughout the colonies resigned their offices in order to avoid Oliver's fate. By November, the Stamp Act could be implemented only in the frontier colony of Georgia, and even there for only a short time. The colonists also began a limited boycott of British imports in an effort to build support for repeal of the Stamp Act with Britain. By the spring of 1766, Grenville was out of office, and his replacement, Lord Rockingham, who had never liked the Stamp Act, was ready to give in. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but it also passed a declaratory act that asserted its power to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Then, rather than leave bad enough alone, the British government again tried to tax the colonists. Then we have the Townshend crisis. In 1767, after Rockingham had left office, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, proposed to raise money in America by levying new duties on imported glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The Townshend Act, or Revenue Act of 1767, was designed, as its preamble said, to raise a revenue for defraying the charge of administration of justice and the support of civil government in such provinces where it shall be found necessary, and to help pay for defending, protecting, and securing the said dominions. That was a double attack on the colonies' elected assemblies. It denied their exclusive power to tax their constituents, and it also threatened their role as paymaster of royal officials, a role they used to make those appointees respect colonial interests. This time, a Philadelphia lawyer called his countrymen to action. John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania first appeared as a series of essays in the Pennsylvania Chronicle. They were widely republished in other colonial newspapers and later printed together in a popular pamphlet. Dickinson defined a tax as, quote, an imposition on the subject for the sole purpose of levying money, end quote. The distinction bandied about in London between external and internal taxes, between duties on trade and taxes raised within the colonies, was meaningless. All measures to raise revenue were taxes. The Townshend duties were for Dickinson as objectionable and as worthy of opposition as the Stamp Act. During the resistance to the Stamp Act, crowd violence sometimes got out of hand. In Boston, for example, a mob attacked several officials involved in a crackdown on smugglers and tore down the home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. A demonstration in Newport, Rhode Island, lasted 4 days of uncontrolled rioting. Dickinson wanted to avoid similar outbreaks of disorder. The cause of liberty, he wrote, is a cause of too much dignity to be sullied by turbulence and tumult. End quote. Instead, he recommended starting with another round of petitions. He was confident that they would work. He said, quote, "We have an excellent prince in whose good dispositions toward us may confide. We may confide," he wrote, "in a generous, sensible, humane nation to ask for redress." End quote. But if the colonists' petition failed, he recommended that the colonists withhold from Britain, quote, "the advantages she has been used to receive from us." That is, the colonists should cut off imports and see if our ingenuity, industry, and frugality will not give weight to our remonstrances. Colonists everywhere toasted the Pennsylvania farmer and followed his advice. When petitions failed, they negotiated provincial non-importation agreements. In some ports, those agreements cut imports by more than half. British exporters managed to blunt the impact of the colonial boycotts by selling more in other markets. Nonetheless, by the year 1770, the King's new minister, Lord North, recommended repeal of the Townshend duties on commercial principles. Parliament agreed but kept the duty on tea to show that it retained the right to tax the colonists, the same reason it had passed a declaratory act when it repealed the Stamp Act 4 years earlier. Some colonists wanted to maintain the non-importation agreements until all their grievances were redressed. But one by one, the colonies deserted the agreements and resumed trading. Sometimes at New York and Philadelphia, colonists continued an informal boycott of legally imported tea and instead got their tea from smugglers. But at Boston, a handful of merchants who had never joined the non-importation agreement happily paid the Townshend duty on imported tea and apparently had no problem selling it to retail customers. What particular circumstances will in any future case justify resistance by force can never be ascertained till they happen. In 1776, John Dickinson refused to vote for independence but joined the militia. Although in May of 1776, Maryland Congressman Thomas Stone wrote, quote, "To cut the only bond which held the discordant members of the empire together seems to me the most weak and ill-judged measure I have ever met in a state which has the least pretension to wisdom or knowledge in the affairs of men." End quote. Concerning the tea crisis, to some, the years after 1770 were a time of quiet. For others, like Boston's Samuel Adams, it was instead a period of sullen silence. The issue of what rights Parliament had over the American colonies remained unresolved. Moreover, the faith in the British king and nation expressed by John Dickinson began to be seriously questioned. During the mid-1760s, colonists had frequently explained Britain's violations of Americans' rights as a result of misinformation from unfriendly governors and other royal officials within the colonies. Soon, however, the government in London adopted other policies toward the English radical John Wilkes and toward Ireland, for example, that echoed those applied to America. First the members of Parliament, then the King's ministers, and occasionally by 1770 even the King himself seemed involved in a plot to undermine the liberty of Britons, both in America and elsewhere, including England itself. The British government sent troops to Boston in 1768 to reinforce the authority of royal officials. On the 5th of March, 1770, a handful of soldiers shot into a hostile mob and killed 5 Bostonians, an event remembered as the Boston Massacre. 2 years later, a crowd of men from Providence, Rhode Island, attacked and burned a royal ship, the HMS Gaspee, that had been disrupting trade in Narragansett Bay. The Crown appointed a special investigating commission with power to send accused persons to England for trial and in order to call for British troops if that seemed necessary. These events were local and isolated, although news of them spread throughout the colonies. Nothing awoke widespread opposition to Britain until 1773, when Parliament passed a Tea Act to help the financially strained East India Company, or the EIC, sell its large stock of imported tea in colonial markets. The act allowed the EIC company to sell tea directly through its own agents or consignees in America rather than auction it off to merchants whose commissions added to the product's final cost. The act also provided duties paid in England on tea that was shipped to America. Perhaps the company could then price its tea low enough to compete with smugglers. East India Company tea would, however, remain subject to the old townshend duty, which Lord North refused to repeal. The new arrangements also gave the company a monopoly that squeezed many American merchants out of the tea trade. To make matters worse, the company chose as co-signees merchants who had been opponents of the old non-importation movement, including the sons of Thomas Hutchinson, then the royal governor of Massachusetts. Opposition in New York and Philadelphia succeeded in getting the co-signees to resign and then persuaded the captains of tea ships to return to England with their cargoes. In Boston, however, the first tea ship, the Dartmouth, slipped into the harbor on the 28th of November, and others followed in early December. The co-signees refused to resign and fled to the protection of British troops on an island in the harbor. If customs duties on the Dartmouth's cargo remained unpaid 20 days after the ship's arrival, customs officials could seize it, and then tea would be surely to be released to the co-signees, who would then pay the duties, opening the way for more parliamentary taxation and disgrace Boston in the eyes of patriots elsewhere. In 1754, during the French and Indian War, Benjamin Franklin lamented, quote, "The present disunited state of the British colonies," published his Join or Die political cartoon, and provided a rallying cry for the decades to come. For 20 days, opponents of the Tea Act from Boston and neighboring towns tried unsuccessfully to get clearance papers from customs agents and the governor so that the ships could return the tea to England. And finally, on the night of December the 16th, 1773, a group of men dressed as Indians boarded the ships and tossed 342 chests of tea into the harbor. They acted in a quiet, disciplined manner. Bystanders heard only the sound of axes cracking open the chests and the plop, plop, plop of tea dropping into the water. The Indians destroyed nothing else. Of course, when a small padlock was inadvertently broken, they found another to replace it, and when a participant stuffed some tea into his pockets, he was stripped of his clothes and forced to run home naked. The news from Boston threw the king's ministers into a fury. In 1774, Parliament approved 4 coercive acts, which the colonists soon labeled the Intolerable Acts. There was the Boston Port Act, which closed the port until the town paid for the destroyed tea and compensated customs officers who had suffered damage during their uprisings there. Then there was the Massachusetts Government Act, which changed the charter of 1691 by making members of the council or upper house of the legislature appointed by the crown rather than elected by the lower house, allowed the governor to remove on his own authority all judges, ended the election of juries, and abolished all town meetings except one each year for electing officials. That substantially reduced the colonists' participation in their government and increased the power of the crown. Adding insult to injury, the king appointed General Thomas Gage, governor of the colony, essentially putting Massachusetts under military rule. Then there was the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed crown officials accused of committing murder while executing their offices to be tried in England if the royal governor decided they could not get a fair trial in Massachusetts. The colonists quickly called it the Murder Act because they feared it would encourage royal officials to kill colonists. A new Quartering Act, which applied to all the colonies, allowed military commanders to quarter troops in vacant houses and other buildings. Standing armies were going to be a standard fixture in America, even though, as the colonists kept saying, free men weren't governed at the point of a gun. With these measures, the Anglo-American conflict moved far beyond a dispute over taxation. If the people of America refused to submit to the coercive acts, the king's minister for the American colonies said, quote, "They say in effect that they will no longer be a part of the British Empire," end quote. From the colonists' perspective, submission required surrender to a government determined to destroy the colony's English liberty. As the Virginia planter George Washington wrote on the 4th of July, 1774, the existence of a regular systematic plan against American freedom had become, quote, "as clear as the sun in its meridian brightness," end quote. The only acceptable response was resistance. The beginnings of self-government and the founding of the state. Resistance was not revolution. It was meant to prevent oppressors and to safeguard lawful rights, but not to undermine the rule of law or overturn the government. The colonists, however, took over, crisis by crisis, more and more powers of self-government. In late November of 1765, For example, after enforcement of the Stamp Act had already been stopped, organizations called the Sons of Libertas began to appear throughout the colonies. The first Sons of Liberty group was a quasi-military organization that promised to assist New York if the Crown used the Royal Army to enforce the Stamp Act there. Later, the Sons worked to keep the Stamp Act from being implemented while preventing acts of private vengeance. Sometimes, as at Albany, New York, they professed their royal loyalty to the king and the British Constitution, while establishing an elaborate committee structure for processing accusations against accused Stamp Act supporters. Royal officials such as Thomas Hutchinson complained bitterly that the authority of every colony is in the hands of the Sons of Liberty. After news arrived that the Stamp Act had been repealed, the Sons of Liberty dissolved, a sure sign that their objectives were limited and that their objectives had been accomplished. During the Townshend crisis, committees entrusted with enforcing the non-importation agreements assumed authority over trade and even tried to regulate prices. Like the old Sons of Liberty, non-importation committees tried and punished violators of the agreements, usually by imposing social and economic boycotts on those enemies of their country. But the committees also disappeared after the partial repeal of the Townshend duties and the collapse of the non-importation agreements. A more lasting transfer of authority came with the meeting of a First Continental Congress to coordinate colonial opposition to the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts. 12 colonies, all except Georgia, sent delegates to that Congress, which met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia from the 5th of September to the 26th of October, 1774. Soon after assembling, it endorsed a set of radical resolutions passed by an extra-legal convention in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. The resolutions held that the coercive acts were unconstitutional and should not be obeyed, discouraged paying taxes to the royal government of Massachusetts, and called on colonists to arm. Later, the Congress told the patriots in Massachusetts to act only on the defensive. If, however, the Crown tried to enforce its policies with armed force, quote, all America ought to support them in the opposition, end quote. The Congress went on to approve a declaration of the colonists' rights and a list of parliamentary acts that violated those rights, much as the British Parliament had done in 1689. Congress also petitioned the king for redress and sent addresses to the people of Britain, Quebec, and America, above all to bring pressure on the British government. It adopted a broad non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation agreement called the Continental Association. Committees elected in every county, city, and town in America by persons qualified to vote for members of their provincial assemblies would enforce the association. Finally, the Congress called for the meeting of another Congress on the 10th of May, 1775, if America's grievances had not been redressed. By that date, news of the outbreak of war at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, on the 19th of April, 1775, was spreading through the country. At first, military matters dominated the agenda of the Second Continental Congress. Soon, other issues commanded Congress's attention. As royal governments collapsed, the Congress advised first Massachusetts and later New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Virginia how to reconstitute civil governments. Congress also established a continental post office, took charge of Indian affairs, regulated trade, tried to settle disputes between colonies, and published directions on how to treat colonists who sided with the king. It became, in effect, the first government of what would become the United States of America. The Congress, however, did not advocate separation from Britain. Military operations were undertaken to prevent British conquest until American rights could be secured. Even the new provincial governments, established under Congress's direction, were to remain in effect only until the Anglo-American conflict was settled. In July of 1775, Congress issued a declaration on taking up arms that said the Americans had no intention of dissolving the Union, which has so long and happily subsisted, they said, between them and Britain. The Congress's olive branch petition to the king, drafted in the most respectful terms by John Dickinson and adopted by Congress on the 5th of July, asked the king help in achieving a, quote, permanent and happy reconciliation between Britain and America, end quote. The king refused to receive the petition from Congress's emissaries or to issue an official answer. And so on the 23rd of August, 1775, he issued a proclamation stating that the Americans were engaging in an, quote, open and avowed rebellion, end quote. And on the 26th of October, he told Parliament the American rebellion was, quote, manifestly carried on for the purpose of establishing an independent empire, end quote. All the colonists' expressions of attachment to the parent state, he said, and professions of loyalty to me were meant only to amuse or distract Britain's rulers whilst they were preparing for a general revolt, end quote. Some members of the House of Commons said King George III was putting word independence in the colonists' mouths, and by treating them upon suspicion with every possible violence, he was indeed forcing them toward that which must be our ruin. But the majority approved the King's speech, and in December of 1775 replaced earlier restrictions on colonial trade with a drastic act that prohibited all trade with the 13 colonies. The Prohibitory Act declared the American ships and their cargoes forfeit to the Crown, quote, as if the same were the ships and effects of open enemies, and allowed American seamen to be impressed or drafted into the King's Navy, end quote. And so, he said, many of our subjects in divers parts of our colonies and plantations in North America have at length proceeded to open an avowed rebellion by arraying themselves in a hostile manner to withstand the execution of the law and traitorously preparing, ordering, and levying war against us. And, okay, that was King George III. Independence. News of the King's October speech to Parliament arrived in Philadelphia on the 8th of January, 1776. The next day, the first issue of Common Sense appeared by Thomas Paine, the work of Thomas Paine, a previously undistinguished Englishman who had arrived in America a little over a year earlier. The pamphlet, for the first time, however, had publicly advocated independence. Americans could never be secure in their freedom under British rule, it said, because the Constitution of England included two major errors: monarchy and hereditary succession. What freedom the British had depended not on complex checks and balances, Paine said, but on the Republican or elective component of their government, the House of Commons, which had hopelessly corrupted by the Crown. Americans were slow to abandon British rule because they had no plan for a new government, and so in the hope that his hints would be the means of giving rise to something better, Paine laid out a plan for a new state and continental governments founded entirely on popular choice, with no hereditary rulers, a republic as the Americans came to understand that term. The Americans had it in their power, he said, to form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth, to the benefit of all mankind. Written with language accessible to everyone, common sense rapidly spread throughout the colonies. Suddenly Americans everywhere were debating independence. Not everyone believed Paine's assurance that Americans could hold out against Britain. His insistence that American products would find a market, or his criticisms of the British Constitution. The colonists would surely lose a war with Britain, the strongest military power in all of Europe, Paine's critics said, and be worse off than before. To solicit the help of France would risk subjection to a monarch more absolute than that of King George III. The American economy would stagnate without British purchases, and republics throughout history were short-lived. They dissolved in chaos, which usually led to military rule. Where Paine looked to the birthday of a new world, loyalists, or Americans who rejected independence, saw disaster. In the end, perhaps 20% of the American population sided with the king for a variety of reasons, because they thought the American cause would fail, because they feared for their own rights in a government ruled by the majority, or sometimes because they lived in remote places unaffected by the events that had eroded the loyalty of other colonists. The loyalist ranks included many men who had held royal appointments, from local sheriffs to governors like Thomas Hutchinson, as well as wealthy merchants and landholders, many recent immigrants and ordinary American-born farmers, artisans, and former slaves, many of whom joined the British lines in the search for their own freedom. In fact, most colonists who had advocated independence did so because they saw no alternative but military defeat. In May, news arrived that the king had secured German-speaking soldiers to help suppress the rebellion. Obviously, America needed help, and France was her most likely ally. But the French would only help the colonies if they broke away from Britain. It was, of course, after all, in France's best interest to dismantle her enemy's empire, not to help put it back together. Finally, on the 10th of May, and the 15th of May in 1776, the Continental Congress adopted a resolution with a radical preface that called on the colonies to form new governments. It began by attacking the king, which signaled revolution, for approving the Prohibitory Act, refusing to answer the colonists' petitions for redress, and turning the whole force of Britain, aided by foreign mercenaries, against the good people of these colonies. And it become necessary, it said, that every kind of authority under the said crown should be totally suppressed, and all the powers of government exerted under the authority of the people of these colonies. The pronouncement of, as John Adams observed, was a declaration of independence in all but name. The final vote, however, was seriously divided. On the same day, the 15th of May, Virginia instructed its congressional delegates to propose independence, and so on June the 7th, Richard Henry Lee moved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Following his instructions, Richard Henry Lee also called for the negotiation of foreign alliances and the preparation of a plan of confederation for the consideration and approval of the colonies. Congress debated Lee's first resolution on June the 8th, a Saturday, and the following Monday. Even those who opposed the motion conceded that independence had become inevitable and argued only for delay. Negotiations with France should precede the adoption of independence, they said, or the Americans would have less bargaining power. Moreover, the instructions issued to their congressmen by several colonies, including New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, did not allow them to vote for independence, only to work for reconciliation. The colonies needed to be united on so momentous a decision, and opinion was ripening quickly. In the end, Congress delayed the vote until July in the hope that it would then get stronger support. But on the 11th of June, it appointed a committee of 5 delegates to draft a Declaration of Independence. The committee met, discussed the document, decided on its structure, and appointed its chairman, Thomas Jefferson, to prepare a draft. Thomas Jefferson probably did that in a few days and then submitted his text for comments to fellow committeemen John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Later, the drafting committee, which also included Roger Sherman of Connecticut and Robert R. Livingston of New York, reviewed the revised draft and asked Thomas Jefferson to make some additional changes before sending it to Congress on the 28th of June, 1776. In the meantime, an intense campaign within the various colonies managed to get all but New York to give its delegates power to adopt independence. Towns, counties, grand juries, and other local groups met in the late spring and early summer, urged their legislatures to endorse independence, and sometimes explained why. One after another mentioned how they had loved the British king and people. Their feelings had changed because of the cruelty and injustice of the British government. The United Colonies had tried to get redress of grievances by decent, dutiful, and sincere petitions, giving every assurance of our affection and loyalty. The freemen of Charles County, Maryland, said, but got in return an increase of insult and injury. Both sides grew every day more and more incensed, wrote the freeholders of Buckingham County, Virginia, until the confidence necessary to continue under British rule seemed entirely alienated. Now it was necessary to bid the last adieu, and hope some foreign power may, for their own interest, lend us an assisting hand. These local statements occasionally echoed the language of common sense, but their complaints were against the king, his ministers, members of British Parliament, and those British people who failed to support the colonists. Nonetheless, they assumed and sometimes explicitly demanded that their future government would be Republican, like the temporary constitutional government recently established in South Carolina. Quote, what everyone once dreaded as the greatest misery, separation from Britain, they now unexpectedly find their greatest advantage. A grand jury in the remote Churros district of South Carolina said, the people best capable of governing the American people, they had discovered, were themselves. When Congress resumed discussion of independence on the 1st of July, it remained divided, but the next day, with some shifts in votes, a few strategic absences, and the timely arrival of another delegate from Delaware, it adopted Richard Henry Lee's resolution on independence by a vote of 12-0, with New York abstaining. A week later, New York added its consent, but not without lamenting the cruel necessity which has rendered that measure unavoidable. With independence adopted, Congress turned to the draft the Declaration of Independence. It spent most of the next 2 days editing the document, removing words, phrases, and one whole passage, adjusting the language and replacing part of the final paragraph, the one that declared independence, with words from the Lee Resolution. And finally, on the 4th of July, the delegates approved the text and sent it to the printer John Dunlap. Within days, copies went out to the states and army with instructions that it be so distributed that the mass of the people know that, quote, these united colonies had become at last free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to the British crown. The revolutionary generation employed the pen long before brandishing the sword. As early as 1776, Thomas Paine observed that volumes had already been written on the conflict between England and America. The newspapers of colonial cities like Boston filled columns of type with political philosophy. Broadsides hawked on streets tried to sway public opinion. Poet Phyllis Wheatley, the first published African-American woman in North America, used a cautiously optimistic poem to appeal to King George III for enlightened leadership. As the divide between country and colony widened, blatant propaganda like Paul Revere's drawing of the Boston Massacre used images to heighten opposition to king and parliament. The Continental Congress, meeting in Independence Hall, resorted to words again by sending George III the olive branch petition. Spoiling for a confrontation, the king responded with words of his own. He declared the colonies in open revolt. Many individual founders participated in this written dialogue. John Adams, for example, wrote his influential Thoughts on Government, just as one colony after another drafted constitutions replacing British rule. After warfare erupted, the pen became a powerful ally of the sword. In his immensely popular pamphlet Common Sense, Thomas Paine denounced British rule, fomenting revolutionary sentiment. As the American army encamped at Valley Forge, his The Crisis bolstered support for independence. In 1776, the Second Continental Congress, no longer conciliatory, resulted to words again when it prepared a Declaration of Independence. Members had no illusions that they would sway king or parliament. Instead, they addressed not yet committed colonists and the community of nations. Jefferson's powerful words did more. They echoed across time in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the speeches of Frederick Douglass, the Declaration of Sentiments written at the Women's Rights Conference, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. On February the 13th, 1818, John Adams wrote Hezekiah Niles a letter. The revolution, he said and advised, was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. End quote. While national parks protect a superior collection of landscapes, buildings, and artifacts, they also preserve less tangible treasures like ideas that shaped the duties and obligations shouldered by ancestors. Sites commemorate landmark events in the history of freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and freedom of the press. Red Hill commemorates the genius of Patrick Henry, an orator skilled at capturing and expressing political sentiments. He was also had a law office as well. Independence National Historic Park not only preserves original printed copies of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, but also explores principles like life, libertas, and the pursuit of happiness. The Liberty Bell also challenges visitors to think about the liberties that they enjoy and where liberty remains unattained. Federal Hall, which is a site of the first United States Capitol, focuses on leadership and individual rights, as well as limited government. Next, we will talk about the War for Independence in our next lecture.